Welcome to the Grinders Table, the podcast where we sit with C-suite executives and founders who are taking their industry by storm to figure out how you can build an exceptional career and business. Together, we'll try to uncover how they are both defying the odds and what you can learn from their experience.
Today's guest went from dreaming of Goldman Sachs to becoming one of Africa's most influential blockchain advocates. But his journey just started with something very simple. Read the Bitcoin white paper, something I would not do anyways. But right now, Brenton is shaping the future of African fintech. And I believe that he has so much to share with us today that will be relevant for every one of you that will be listening. Brenton, thank you for coming. Why crypto? Why Bitcoin?
So firstly, thank you so much for having me. I feel like I'm amongst amazing company because I'm always a frequent reader of the newsletter and also the Grinders Table. But no, I mean, it's actually a very, very interesting and funny story. So like you said, right, we're studying quantitative finance. The goal was to kind of, your quintessential kind of Wall Street ambitions. And I heard about this thing called Bitcoin, right? And this is probably 2016, around that time frame when it was starting to really make the news. And my first initial thoughts, like many people, which is why I think I get it, was this is probably some sort of Ponzi scheme. But, as we do when we're very young, studying to be a Wall Street banker, I thought, I'm smart enough that I can figure out the loophole here and maybe, make some money. So my first point of call at that stage was like, look, if I'm going to figure out where the loopholes are in this thing, I've got to get a better understanding of it. And there's no better place to start than the Bitcoin white paper, right? Which I think, I stand to be corrected, but it's not a very long piece of literature. It's about 8 pages, I think, or it's not too long. And so I was like, look, let me start here. Let me read this thing and I'll be able to pick out exactly where the gaps are and, however this thing works and how I can exploit that to make money. And, it might sound a little bit poetic, but literally by the time I'd read the last word on the last page, I'd be being completely what we call in the industry orange pilled. So I went completely down the rabbit hole from that stage. And I think because I had a really good understanding or foundation in how the financial world works, how financial markets work, how, particularly fractional reserve banking work, the penny immediately dropped for me. And from that day forward, I've kind of been sold on the industry.
Would you say you're now motivated by money because you wanted to make a quick buck, at least in your words?
No, definitely, right? So definitely, I think again to kind of just remove all of the filters. I think even largely that was one of the motivations for wanting to kind of become an investment banker on Wall Street. One was definitely I hear the money is quite good, but two, it was kind of I guess kind of ego driven as well, right? Just around status. They were kind of or that industry was viewed as kind of the one of the quintessential kind of career routes you could take. So yes, I think definitely status and money, to be honest, were kind of some of the initial drivers of the decision of me wanting to go in that direction.
Again, I have no problem with people chasing money. One of the things that I try to extract from people that I want to work with and even founders is I try to look at if they are missionaries or mercenaries. And honestly, I don't really care what you choose to be. My point is, or what I'm looking for is if I can work with you, our values align, and if you can get, I can extract it as much value from you as possible, or you can give value to me as well. But you find that really there is actually a palatable difference between founders who want to make money and who are just focused on solving problems that they've experienced. And again, that's somewhat tied to, having a mission and be mission driven. Do you think it matters to actually be mission driven or just focus on the money? Because it's a means to an end, in my own opinion. But I want to get your thoughts.
So that's a great question. Look, I apply very much the same framework when understanding kind of a founder's motivations. That missionary or mercenary framing. I think why it's important, particularly from a startup journey perspective, is as a I don't want to say recovering founder myself. I know just how difficult the journey is, and I think, in my view, money may not be enough of a motivator for you to stick with that journey and overcome some of the obstacles that you will inevitably run into. And that's why we kind of lean more towards or have a bias towards a missionary framework when looking at founders. And I think largely, that was kind of the shift for me when I inherently understood kind of the elitism and kind of the barriers that existed in the financial world. And that was the penny drop moment for me when I read the Bitcoin white paper, was really opening up these kind of opportunities and creating a fairer, more equitable system that wasn't kind of permissioned to this elite group of people. And, if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have gone on this very difficult founder journey and kind of ended up where I am today in the space.
Do you think that in a way, and I'm actually trying to weigh myself in this question, in a way, there's a bit of privilege when you talk about being, focusing more on the mission or optimizing for the mission than actually making some money. Again, this is not trying to put you in the spot or say the one is better than the other. I'm just asking out of curiosity because I believe that everybody, once in a while or at different times of their life struggle with, should I just go in this for the money or is it about, the mission?
Look, it's a good question. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive in the sense that I think you can have a missionary mindset or motivating factors while still being very realistic about the fact that you want to do well in life, you want to live comfortably. We often see there's a fair balance between one of the biggest mistakes I think I often see founders make is trying to just optimize for giving themselves the least amount of burn and paying themselves the least amount of money, where I think you do yourself a disservice in that. So I think the best blend is somebody with primary kind of missionary driven motivations, but that's realistic about the fact that they want to do well financially as well. And I know that's a little bit of a cop out answer, but that's the one I'm going to go with.
That's actually cool. And no, I don't think it's a cop-out answer. But let's go to your background. I mean, from Goldman Sachs, people literally die to be there, right? And here you are now. If you look back, do you think that, actually, let me rephrase that. What would you have done differently when you look back?
So that's a really, really interesting question. Yeah, I don't think I take enough time for reflection, to be honest. I think I wouldn't have done much differently. To, I think I would have just sought out mentorship and surrounded myself with experience and knowledge a lot earlier than I did in the journey. A lot of mistakes as a founder, as I think many founders do, and then kind of as an entrepreneur building out a consulting and advisory business that I didn't really need to make. They were quite obvious in hindsight. And if I just surrounded myself with the right people, I could have avoided those. But other than that, I think it was kind of, this serendipitous sequence of events that landed me where I am now. And I think I'm very happy with where that is. I think if I had gone another path, to answer the question more specifically, if I had really pursued that path of going deeply into the investment banking space, of trying to pursue a career on Wall Street, which was my ambition while I was in university, I don't think I'd be as satisfied as I am now in what I do.
Hmm. I'm also of that philosophy that life is a compound of all the little things you do per time and the little decisions you make per time. And oftentimes, looking forward, it's really, really hard to predict where you will end up in 10, 20 years because every day is a decision that sort of might cause an inflection in your direction. And now for you, wanting to be an investment banker, getting that dream job, what were the little things you did along the way beyond reading the Bitcoin white paper that sort of set you on the spot?
Again, really, really good questions. Probably things that I should reflect on more frequently. But I think it was that combined with, not to say this is good or bad, but I think at the time was really when we saw this Web 2 evolution of social networks, etc., really rising to fame. And with that kind of, what I think we know to be very different to the true archetype of what successful founders look like, particularly in Africa, but uh, it was being glamorized very much. Of drop out, start a tech startup, scale, build a solution. I think a lot of that was glamorized, combined with this kind of newfound passion that I developed for kind of this technology. I think it was a number of those different events, both kind of external and internal, that led me down the path of moving into kind of the innovation space, and then very shortly thereafter becoming a founder myself, raising a very humble amount of money. So I think again, just to be quite transparent, I think I was largely influenced, but definitely kind of what were the persistent trends at the time definitely influenced some of my decision making, which I don't think in hindsight to what we were chatting about is a bad thing. I don't think you should generally kind of follow trend, but it seems to have worked out pretty well for me in hindsight.
The trend, talking about trends in 2020, that was when I think that COVID and, people having that extra cash to play around sort of enabled the proliferation of, crypto and blockchain solutions. Because I remember in 2020, almost every deck, you know, came to my desk had some blockchain related solution. I feel like in Africa, you also played a major role in that because you helped Binance launch across multiple African markets. Has your theory on blockchain and its implication for the continent of Africa changed between then and now?
It hasn't changed. Again, to be quite honest, I think particularly in Africa, but this is true globally, that like for a long time, the only truly kind of persistent use case of the technology, and the only thing arguably that really found product market fit, was kind of speculation, right? That's all of the large businesses in the space, all of the businesses that were doing well, that were making money, were really just some derivative of a way for you to speculate on asset prices in the space. I think this is true for a lot of the people that got involved really on. Is just that's obviously not the vision that we had for the industry. And for a long time, that was the only real thing that was going on. I think we've now seen an inflection point in this, I think, from a global adoption has been stablecoins and the emergence of stablecoins. Arguably they were the second thing in the space to really find product market fit from a blockchain perspective. And I think that's catalyzed a number of these other use cases. You've got founders like Vlad Tenev at Robinhood now talking about the fact that he thinks tokenization will be the biggest innovation in financial markets over the next decade. So I think now I'm a lot less disillusioned. We're starting to see real world use cases and efficiencies come to market. And that's particularly true in Africa. I think we saw that a lot earlier in Africa than we did globally, just because the needs are so much more evident here for kind of a lot of the problems that technologies like stablecoins solve. And that's true of a lot of emerging markets, Latin America, Southeast Asia. But I think during my time at Binance, I got to see the first inklings of that in markets like Nigeria, markets like Kenya. And, that's when I almost got this reignited passion for the ability of this technology to fundamentally kind of change people's lives.
Yeah, a big part of getting more people to understand crypto, stablecoin, the blockchain is education and creating, would I say, utility use cases or use cases that the everyday person will be able to understand and use easily. If we're putting this in a better context in Africa, looking at the educational level, the tech level, how do you think we can play this game so that we can meet up with the rest of the world? And coincidentally, I think it's the same problem everywhere. It's, again, the blockchain, crypto is more than just a wallet, it's more than just speculating. There is much more to life than that. How do you think we can go about deploying solutions across the continent that is more relevant to us and more people can use, especially the older generation?
Great question. And I think, like you said, this has been a persistent problem across the industry. I think so. There's two ways, I guess, that I'll answer this that are kind of my personal view, but I think it's shared quite widely in the industry. The one is crypto has always had a UX UI problem, right? To your point, if we really want this technology to become ubiquitous, you can't be expecting people to manage different chains, 16-digit hexadecimal addresses. Like, all of that is just far too technically complex for the average person. So crypto's always had a UX problem, and we've seen technologies come in now like account abstraction, which means you can set up and back up accounts using things like your Gmail account. We've seen the underlying infrastructure scale quite a bit to where you can now make transactions in under a second that cost fraction of a cent. So I think a lot of it had to do with the technology evolving to a stage where it became very, very usable to wider populations and for wider use cases. But the second, I think, is, we hate when founders, or let me rather say me, but I know this is true, when founders go, "Oh, I'm building a blockchain business." At the end of the day, our view is you're building a business, but you're utilizing a technology that's delivering an efficiency or creating a new modality of doing something somewhere in the background, whether that's payments, whether that's we were talking about like commodities and agriculture marketplaces. That's what you're really building. This technology is just a means to the end somewhere in the background. And your job as a founder is to utilize the technology in such a way that it delivers those efficiencies, but it's abstracted away from the end user. Where, to use the most simple kind of use case, if we're building a remittance app, your job is to make sure that the end user can click three buttons and say, I want this amount of money to go there. And it gets there fast, it gets there cheap, and it gets there close to, if not 100% of the time. How you do that in the back end, I think, is of no business to the end user. And I think we're starting to slowly get to a place where founders are realizing this, and the infrastructure is at a place where you can do that as well.
Do you think that Africa can lead the charge, given that there actually are fundamental use cases for the continent of Africa, especially with stablecoins, and we see how well this has helped with moving money across borders, making payments, setting up accounts. For the continent of Africa, how do you think we can spearhead these innovation in this space that everybody's more focused on, again, speculating, making more money off it, but there are real life use cases that we can apply here and show that this works.
I think emerging markets are 100% ground zero for a lot of the use cases of this technology, and particularly Africa, because I'll give you a perfect example. We've invested in a company that is essentially using a blockchain-based ledger to prevent property fraud from kind of the way archaic way title deeds are stored at the moment. If you speak to people in Switzerland or Japan, that makes no sense because the infrastructure works. But here we have those core infrastructure problems that mean that the technology has really, really strong kind of, let's call it, technology market fit. So I definitely think we can be ground zero for a lot of the use cases, but I think the same is true for the wider emerging market space. So markets like Latin America, Southeast Asia, they all have this persistent set of problems, this infrastructure deficit that this technology is very well suited to solving. But again, we've got to make sure that we have the right talent who's trying to solve those problems, that they've got the right infrastructure surrounding them in terms of funding, in terms of actual physical infrastructure that they may need to build these solutions. So I definitely think Africa can be ground zero for a lot of these solutions, but we still see some persistent problems that are kind of external to the industry that might slow us down a bit.
Let's make a segue to something that you said recently that caught my attention. You said actually you believe that the future would be brand based rather than firm based. In other words, people are going to be trusting individuals over institutions. What do you think is driving this shift?
So I think it's just where the world is moving, in the sense that if I look at the landscape of kind of, our generation and younger generations, I mean, I'm not going to name our generation because yeah, I don't want to out us like that, but we're not that old. But particularly younger generations as well, if you look at the way they engage with the world, social media being kind of one of the biggest conduits to that. 10 years ago, influencer marketing didn't exist because the value and the equity needed to be created at the brand level. Whereas now, people are using, or brands and corporations are using individuals as this conduit to manufacture trust, to manufacture perceived quality. Because people are placing more credence in these individuals whose kind of values they resonate with, whose kind of lifestyles they resonate with at an individual level, to act as this gateway or gatekeeper to products, services, corporate brands, etc. Even in terms of purchasing decisions, right? 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the average consumer didn't really care where this loaf of bread that they bought came from, or this carton of milk. But now we're starting to see provenance become a much bigger input factor in kind of influencing purchase decisions. And I think at a macro scale, we start to see this kind of permeate throughout all different industries, ours as well, where, I think it was, I can't remember the exact podcast, but Mark Andreessen gave a long form kind of interview recently where he kind of alluded to the fact that they're seeing this barbell distribution kind of in the venture capital space, where the whole middle of that distribution is being eradicated, and the only two outcomes he sees as being truly successful is, on the one side, you've got this hyper verticalized firm structure that is smaller, more nimble, kind of really strong individual brands, really deep kind of subject matter expertise. And on the completely other end of the spectrum, you've got these massive kind of behemoths of industry that just, have the equivalent of unlimited balance sheets and enough management fees to really create strong platform teams. So I really see that playing out, but more of a divergence towards the earlier of the two that I mentioned. So founders are going to really want to work with individuals who have strong brands and values that they resonate with on an individual level, that have relevant backgrounds and experiences and networks on an individual level that they resonate with. And kind of how that manifests is, I think, in my view, founders are going to become more concerned with which partner they're dealing with and which partner is leading the deal, as opposed to the underlying firm that partner works for. And I think we're starting to see this increased mobility between firms where, QED, etc. A lot of those partners are branching off, founding their own, I don't want to call them micro firms because they're still 10 times larger than what we used to here in Africa, but much smaller than kind of the parent firms that they emanate from. So I definitely see that trend continuing in the venture space, in my opinion.
Yeah. But again, this sort of suggests a fundamental change in how trust works. Interestingly, your industry is all about trust. Are we becoming more tribal, or do you think that we are now more discerning?
I mean, that's a really good question. I don't think we're necessarily becoming more tribal, but I think we're just placing greater weight on individuals versus corporates. Like, I think the most clear example for this for me is kind of this influencer space, and how, you know, individuals are kind of utilizing other individuals as conduits to how they make these purchasing decisions. So they're almost outsourcing, for lack of a better term, their trust decisions to this trusted individual intermediary who they resonate with from a brand perspective, from a values perspective, from a lifestyle perspective. I think for me, that's more it, where previously you weren't able to reach into the individual level, but technology, social media, etc., has allowed us now to reach and resonate more at the individual level, which is kind of now disintermediating the brand and kind of creating this layer between the ultimate corporation and kind of the way we view them.
A big part of your job and your role and the industry you play in is sort of indexing on what could be, what the future could be, right? Are there times where you've looked at opportunities and it has been totally wrong? And how do you deal with being wrong?
Many, many times, my friend, many times. I think, yeah, you're right. What we do a lot of the time is kind of underwrite to a view of the future. I think you are often going to be wrong, as is the case, particularly with this industry. But again, as someone who, I'd like to think is relatively young in the space, I like to lean on the shoulders of giants when trying to learn, when trying to develop kind of these heuristic frameworks. Um, and another interesting data point and again, I think we need to stop leaning on kind of there's things that work from the Silicon Valley model of VC in Africa and there's things that don't. One interesting observation is that the most successful VC firms that have managed to create persistent brands and persistently outperform the rest of the industry actually have a worse hit rate than the average VC firm. So they're wrong more often than the average VC firm, but they make such asymmetric bets that when they're right, they're significantly right. And that kind of blends to a much higher return. So I think being wrong is okay. There's nothing wrong with being wrong, but you need to have a specific framework that you've underwritten that to. And then again, I think being wrong about a macro trend is okay if you've done the work and there was a very kind of rational, logical kind of path that you underwrote to this future, because none of us can predict the future. But being wrong on an individual level is kind of, particularly if you haven't done the work, is what's more concerning. And being wrong consistently in a specific way just means that you aren't learning. So I think it's okay to be wrong at a macro level. It's okay to be wrong on a view of the future that you had that never materialized. But again, there's certain mistakes where you really shouldn't be making. But being wrong in and of itself, I think, is a feature, not a bug, as we like to say.
Feature, not a bug. Absolutely true. We're going to go right into our rapid fire section. Let's get right into it. What's the worst advice that's been commonly given to entrepreneurs that you think?
Well, that's a hard one because there's so much. I think just build it and they will come. I could keep going on for less, but I think that's the biggest one. Just build it and they will come.
What is one contrarian belief about blockchain that you hold that others think is crazy?
I think that much of capital markets and financial markets infrastructure over the next decade will become blockchain based.
And don't we have a scenario where, again, now I've left. Anyways, I needed to ask you this. You have a scenario where the behemoths, so the BlackRocks, the Sequoias, begin to acquire some of the infrastructure behind this technology and then eventually own the market. Again, this is just me asking as a layman.
No, look, I think there's a lot of benefits to them utilizing this tech from the fact that they have inherent distribution. I think, one of the biggest risks to the stablecoin incumbents is the recent approval of the Genius Act, which kind of, for lack of to go into the basics, essentially opens the floodgates for the Citibanks of the world, the UBSs of the world, etc., to launch their own stablecoins. I don't think that in and of itself is a bad thing, because there's efficiencies the technology delivers that can be passed through to the end consumer, where if it's a large centralized company that is operating that infrastructure, as long as they're doing so utilizing kind of this core public infrastructure, I think there's no particular problem with that. We all saw how, previously, particularly companies like IBM, etc., tried to create this private permissioned environment with blockchain, where we all thought the future was private and permission, but for a number of reasons, all of that failed dismally. So because of that, you need to utilize this public infrastructure in one way or another. And I think as long as the large incumbents, even if they're centralizing, for lack of a better term, these solutions, but they're utilizing that infrastructure, I think it largely still holds true the core value proposition that we're trying to achieve in the space.
Who is one person that has fundamentally changed how you think?
Oh, that's a really good question. Does it have to be someone that I know personally, or just someone that
It doesn't have to be
who's
someone that you're close to.
perfect? I think someone whose frameworks and thought patterns I really, really enjoy, who's helped frame things for me, is Naval Ravikant.
And finally, what's the best piece of advice that you've received?
If you persistently work harder at something than everybody else over a long arc of time, it's almost impossible to fail.
Wow, that's something. I'm taking my notes here. That was really, really, that's really good advice. In rounding up, I'd like to actually explore a few more things with you. And there's something you talked or and and I actually have strong opinions about this anyways. But
Yeah.
you said something around, work-life balance. What is work-life balance to you?
So and I think that in and of itself is the most important question, right? Is everybody has their own definition of work-life balance. And I think conversely, everybody has their own definition of success. And that's kind of the framework you need to approach this, kind of whole question with. But for me, speaking about the more generalistic view, work-life balance is, trying to balance all these different priorities that we have in our lives in a perfect harmony and ratio. So family, hobbies, personal time, fitness, you know, relaxation, and then of course work. So just all these different kind of competing priorities we have in our life or things that we'd like to do. Finding this perfect ratio of balance between them, I think, is a more generalistic view or definition of work-life balance.
Yeah, I think what actually defines how I think about it and how I've seen my life evolve was Jeff Bezos, where he said it's about prioritization, prioritizing what is most important per time. One day it might be work, the next day might be your wife, the next day might be your child. Learning to juggle all that and prioritize it per time is what exactly gives you a balance in life. And then, in rounding up, I'd like to touch on something that a conversation that I had with a couple of people a few weeks back, and we're talking about being exceptional.
Mhm.
And the general thinking was younger folks, and for lack of a better way to describe them, the Gen Zs have stopped being exceptional, or they lack that trait of exceptionalism. And we're all thinking out loud, why exactly is that? One person was of the opinion, I'm not going to mention his name so it doesn't feel like I'm bragging, but he was like, I mean, why would people give to you 100% when the world never gives them 100%? So, and he used the example of mortgage, to get a mortgage now costs way more than it cost our parents too. And so people are working and chasing in the rat race, and it feels like they're not moving the needle. And so they've stopped being exceptional for that reason. Another person was of the opinion was that it's a culture thing, and because people are not thought to be exceptional, the world is going to shit, right? You can see that in some exceptional cultures, you see the way they do things, and in some other cultures, you find out that there's less exceptionalism because of how things are done or how the quality of your work is usually appraised. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. How do we ensure that people remain exceptional in the jobs? Because we're all leaders, and how do you encourage exceptionalism if it's not typically part of the culture nowadays?
I've similar to that conversation. I have a lot of my own personal views around this, but I think having a very clear alignment of, and it's a very personal thing, right? What success looks like to you and what your ambitions are from an achievement perspective, and then creating a very, very clear roadmap, if you will, of what it takes to achieve those outcomes. I think, in my view, there's a very big disconnect in current society around what people want and what it takes to get that. Even at a larger societal level, I think oftentimes that is one of the core contributing factors to a lot of the things we see around like general dissatisfaction, even, things like depression, anxiety. I think I'm going a little bit deep now, but I think you can boil it down to kind of some version of that in terms of what you want and what it requires to get that. So I think having a very clear understanding in terms of coming back to your original question of what it is your ambitions are and what it's going to require to get those. And requirements are not always about what is the input output relationship directly, right? And I think that's also really important, right? You need to work really, really hard. You need to understand what that level of work required is from you to achieve specific outcomes. But there's also, to the conversation we had earlier about prioritization, is there's an, in my view, again, this is my view, and it changes as stages of life change, as personal circumstances, but there's an opportunity cost to success. And said in a more kind of hard hitting motivational way, you have to give up some things to be successful. There's certain sacrifices that are required. And it's just having an alignment with people around what their view of success is, what their ambitions are, and what sacrifices they're willing to make to achieve that. And I think if everybody is roughly aligned on that, you don't run into those underlying problems because it's very clear what we're all trying to achieve, what's required to achieve that, and what you're willing to do to achieve that.
Yeah, you've all been listening to Brenton, and he has dropped so many nuggets. For every interview, I end with one question. And interesting, you might have answered a bit of it. Between power, money, fame, and pleasure, which is most important to you and which is the least important to you, and why?
That is a real philosophical question. So off the cuff, I'm probably gonna go with money being the most important. And the reason I say that is because I think you can utilize, obviously at different levels, you can utilize that as leverage to achieve any of the other outcomes, right? With money, you can achieve fame. Again, depending what your viewers of or your definition of pleasure is, you can achieve pleasure, you can achieve power. So it's probably the easiest answer because if I prioritize that, I can get the other things. And I'd say the least important thing, again, it depends on. And so when I say pleasure, I'm not speaking about joy. I think joy is very important. But I'd say the least important is probably pleasure because I think people pursue that or expect that too much in modern society, whereas you don't always need to be experiencing pleasure. Sometimes you just need to do what you need to do, and it's not going to be fun. It's not going to be pleasurable. But I think that's different from joy. I think you should definitely experience joy. So I'd say most money, least probably pleasure, specifically
Yeah.
frivolous pleasure.
To your point, I don't know anybody, and people, listeners could correct me, anybody that succeeded in life just chasing what you described as pleasure, right? Just, I want things to, go my way. I want to do it on my terms. It doesn't always happen. But thank you so much for spending the last 40 minutes with us. This was quite a good conversation.
So thank you once again for having me. I've really enjoyed this.
This has been the Grinders Table podcast, bringing you unfiltered insights from Africa's most compelling founders and business leaders. If you had found value in today's conversations, here's how you can help us amplify these stories. Take 30 seconds to share this episode with someone in your network who's building, investing, or curious about Africa. You'll be amazed at how many life-changing connections start from a single shared conversation. And if you're feeling generous, a quick rating and review goes a long way. It helps more founders and business leaders discover these powerful insights. Until next week, keep grinding.